Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, we're going to focus specifically on the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11.
Hi, this is John, and I'm here with Brian McGlinchey. Brian, how are you doing today?
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem. Thank you for being on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read your bio. Brian McGlinchey is the founder and director of 28pages.org, an information and activism hub for the growing nonpartisan movement to declassify a 28-page finding on foreign government support of the 9/11 hijackers. A native of Philadelphia, who now lives in San Antonio, McGlinchey studied political science at Bucknell University, was a U.S. Army officer, and had a career in financial services before becoming a freelance copywriter. And I woohooed after Philadelphia because that's where I'm from as well.
That's right.
And so, let's go ahead and get into the questions. And I know you were thinking about this one. What was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Like for every other American, it was, a terrible day. At the time, I was working in management at USAA, a large financial services company here in San Antonio, in a call center environment. And speaking of Philadelphia, I had a very good friend working there who grew up in also in the Philadelphia area in Broomall, and he and I would always talk Philadelphia Eagles. And that was Tuesday morning, and I hadn't seen him that week yet. And he came over to my desk with a look on his face, and I just started to smile because I thought we were going to talk about the disappointing home loss to the Rams that had happened a few days ago. And he cut me off before I could say anything, and he said, "Do you know what's happening?" This is kind of an odd question, and I just said no. And he said, "Come here," and he took me to a break room, where there were televisions up, and there was that sight up on the screen of the of both towers in flames, and so that I always remember that moment. And as you measure the call center environment, and the calls just suddenly evaporated, and it was a tough day for everybody. For a lot of people, one of their priorities was to call their spouse, and my mindset was to do the opposite. My wife at the time was a stay-at-home wife, a spouse, and I wanted her to live in that pre-9/11 world as long as possible. So she didn't know yet. I didn't want to tell her. I wanted her to have whatever precious extra minutes of blissful ignorance that day that she could have. But so it was a tough day, and then like many people, I think, stayed up very late that evening watching the news reports and the coverage of it, and so that was pretty much the day for me.
Well, it's very interesting. My day of 9/11, once I got home from work and they let us go, I watched the news. My eyes were glued to the news set, and they kept showing the towers falling over and over again, and
right.
It got to me emotionally, and I turned it off and started watching some movies to try and get my mind off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the first thing that you questioned about 9/11?
The first thing that I questioned in any real significant way was this issue of this classified 28 pages.
And how did you come across the knowledge of these 28 redacted pages?
It was through when I saw a press conference video last summer of Congressman Thomas Massey from Kentucky describing his experience of reading the 28 pages, and he did it in such a provocative, attention-getting way that it just caused me to look into it and start researching more and more about it. And it's kind of so many years had already passed, but I hadn't. And for someone who does keep up with things pretty well, I had not really heard of this 28-page section before. So it really
That's actually surprising to me because of all of the different 9/11 cover-ups, the Saudi cover-up, the 28 redacted pages, is actually the cover-up that gets the most attention. So
yeah, and I had been aware of the Saudi, angle or rumors, all of that type of thing that had been percolating out there. But I think that was the first time I actually knew that there was a 28. There's an actual documentation somewhere that could point, as Bob Grimm says, a strong finger specifically, at a country, at Saudi Arabia.
All right. Could you please give us a basic overview of what the 28 redacted pages are and why they should be declassified?
Right. These 28 pages are part of a report of a joint congressional inquiry into 9/11, and specifically into intelligence community activities before and after 9/11. A lot of people, and you even see it in some big media outlets and prominent media platforms, saying that these are in the 9/11 Commission report, but it's actually not. It's not. It's in that report of a joint congressional inquiry that preceded the Commission's work, and this report was published in December of 2002. So it is basically a chapter of that report. That report is hundreds and hundreds of pages, I believe in the vicinity of 800 pages. Now, throughout that, there are lots of sporadic redactions of names and places here and there, and maybe a paragraph. And then you come into something that's quite extraordinary, as Congressman Stephen Lynch recently said. This is an extraordinary redaction to suddenly have 28 full pages, an entire chapter, completely redacted. And this chapter deals with specific sources of foreign government support of the 9/11 hijackers while they were in the United States. And as far as why they should be classified, it's really a matter of transparency, of an informed public. If you think about 9/11 and all that it has unleashed, all that has been done in the name of 9/11, the money that's been spent, the lives that have been expended, the lives that have been harmed and damaged, policies that we have in the country, the American people deserve to know everything the government knows about 9/11. And particularly as we continue to go forward and have policies that are supposed to prevent the next 9/11, an informed public in the republic that we have should know everything the government knows about
Absolutely. That. And, you mentioned the 9/11 Commission, that those 28 redacted pages are not part of the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission was supposed to start its work from where the Joint Congressional Inquiry left off. We'll get into the 9/11 Commission a little bit later. Could you please tell us a little bit about your background with regards to politics? Is 28pages.org your first foray into activism?
Yeah, I've always been somebody who's had an interest in politics and history, and studied political science in college. But this is definitely my biggest foray into any kind of activism, learning as I go.
And when did you decide to found 28pages.org?
It was last July. Again, I had watched the Thomas Massey press conference and then delved deeper from there, reading more about the topic. And as I looked on the web, researching it myself, I found, hey, there's really no one-stop source of information on this issue, or something that was really helping to focus people's interest and energy into actually taking action on it. So when I saw that void there, I decided to go ahead and fill it myself. I am a freelance writer, so I had that, talent, I will say, to share with the world and to share with this movement to help put out a site that had really good information at 28pages.org on the background of the issue, details, links to supporting documents, and then we have an ongoing blog there that keeps people up to date on developments in the issue and commentary on articles and that type of thing that are out there.
Now,
most importantly, I think, is the resources that we have there to help people take action. A lot of people might see this story and think, oh man, I wish they would release those 28 pages. Well, we want to help them take that feeling at that moment they're having it and actually do something, which could be as short as 3 minutes or 4 minutes to call Congress and just get your word in that you want them to help declassify it, or maybe a couple minutes longer to print out one of our pre-written letters, but to help people take action. Because I believe it's going to take political pressure to do this. I don't think we can necessarily rely on the just standard operations of government or the consciences of people in government to declassify it. I think they really need that nudge from the people.
Well, do you remember when I first contacted you, what my first question was?
Yes, I think you were the first person on earth to contact me in this role. And
really? Wow.
Well, I think if something happens on the 9/11 world, I think John Gold is the first one to detect it and be on top of it and know about it.
Well, possibly.
I'd be curious to know.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think you had asked if. I think you were curious about, as people would naturally be, who's behind this effort. This 28pages.org, and I think you were curious about my motives and what I was going after. I think specifically you were wary of I think you said you don't want to start a war with Saudi Arabia, do you? Isn't that right?
Exactly. Well, I just want to, over the years, I've experienced a lot of bullshit with different people, and so I'm a very untrusting soul, unfortunately. You have to earn my trust. So
exactly.
when the last thing I want to do with regards to exposing Saudi Arabia's role with regards to 9/11 is give an excuse for yet another war. My feelings about 9/11 have always been it wasn't an act of war, it was a crime. And you hold individuals responsible for that crime accountable. You don't hold entire nationalities, ideologies, religions accountable for the actions of a few. And there's actually a term for that. It's called collective punishment. And it's a war crime, and it goes against the Geneva Conventions. So the last thing I want to do is start another war. So that was really what I really concerned about. But
right. If you think about the reaction and what we did in the name of 9/11 after it, and how many multiples of the casualty count of 9/11 have now occurred around the world. I see what you mean by avoiding a...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at, my God, what we did to Afghanistan and Iraq, especially Iraq. Upwards of 1.25 million people were killed. Millions were displaced. Their infrastructure was destroyed. We were torturing people at Abu Ghraib. We were flushing Korans down the toilet. We used depleted uranium, and now there are sick babies being born, and it's just absolutely horrible. And part of the problems that we're having today is that there is no statute of limitations on the anger those kinds of things create. So that's part of the tension of what's going on. Part of the individuals that are in Iraq, fighting against the government and so forth. That's part of the problem.
Right.
Another part of
definitely. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, another part of the problem has to do with what we in Saudi Arabia have done over the last couple of years with regards to Syria. and I guess I could quickly get into that. First of all, we've been operating covertly in Syria for years. If you want to read about that, you can read Seymour Hersh's articles at the New Yorker.
Right.
But there became a time when we wanted to take out Assad, and so what happened was, under Bandar, Prince Bandar, who happens to be mentioned within those 28 redacted pages, got rebels, quote-unquote rebels, or moderate rebels, or freedom fighters, or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, and sent them into Syria in an effort to take out Assad. And then the U.S. started sending the rebels intelligence, and then they started sending them arms. And then we started sending in rebels from Jordan. By the way, Kuwait and Qatar were all part of this thing. And to take out Assad. This was all an effort to take out Assad. And those rebels that were sent into Syria, started to collaborate with the people who were angry at the U.S. in Iraq. And so that was essentially the formation of ISIS, what's considered to be ISIS.
Right.
And
that's one of the points that former Senator Bob Graham, who, as you know, is really leading the charge, beyond Capitol Hill, from his position as a former senator, and who was a co-chair of the intelligence inquiry that produced these 28 pages. He's been very forceful in making the point that the suppression of these 28 pages and shielding Saudi Arabia from the consequences of, or accountability of, its involvement in 9/11, he says, has enabled the rise of ISIS, because the behaviors that they had of funding and spreading extremism went unchecked. And given that, they were encouraged to continue the same behavior and the same type of policies, helping to lead to the disaster that we have unfolding right now.
One of the things I'd like to talk about briefly is I wrote an article recently, and the title was, "You Can't Point a Finger at Saudi Arabia and Not Have Five Fingers Pointing Back to the U.S." And what I mean by that is, during the Afghanistan-Russia war, we collaborated with Saudi Arabia and the Pakistani ISI to do essentially what we're doing with the rebels in Syria, to support the Mujahideen. And then in the 90s, we collaborated with the Saudis on illegal weapons deliveries to Bosnian Muslims. We used their networks or connections to terrorism to do certain things. And another thing that we did during the 90s is that there were people like FBI agent Robert Wright, who was actually doing an investigation into terrorist financing. And he started to come across people like al-Qadi, who actually proclaims to have a friendship with Dick Cheney. And his investigation was called Vulgar Betrayal, and it was shut down. They shut it down. And George Tenet will develop these ties.
That code name of that project became a prophecy, didn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. And he gave a very sad press conference sometime in 2002, Robert Wright. It's on my YouTube channel if you want to look it up, Gold9472. And he starts crying, and I feel bad for the guy. But anyway, George Tenet developed a relationship with Bandar, and, as a result of that, George Tenet told people that were investigating certain things to, back off the Saudis a little bit. Another thing that we did in June '96, CIA agents were told not to track militants in Saudi Arabia in the wake of the Khobar Towers bombing. And the reason was they didn't want to upset the Saudi government. So we've enabled them. Before 9/11, we collaborated with them, and so on and so forth. And that was before 9/11. And then after 9/11, that protection continued. It got even worse and more aggressive. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Right. No, I think it's a very good point. It's part of that need for transparency and start to peel that back. The people who've read the 28 pages, they always speak in roundabout ways about what's in there. Another thing that Thomas Massey said was that when these are published, there's going to be anger, frustration, and resentment. And I think a lot of people might at first think he's talking about a foreign country, Saudi Arabia. I think he's talking quite a bit about, as you said, pointing right back at the United States in terms of what we knew, what we neglected, intelligence failures, intelligence cooperation, or with other countries that ended up backfiring, all this type of thing. I think that might be what he's referring to when he talks about that.
Well, I think another thing that he's talking about is the fact that, Bandar is named as being, his wife is connected to money of two of the hijackers in San Diego. Bandar is very close with the Bush family. They call him Bandar Bush. And there are many questions about that relationship. And we'll get into that in a minute. But I wanted to ask you, what are some of the revelations you've heard from people about the 28 redacted pages that most interest you?
Well, not knowing exactly what's in there, the Senator Bob Graham, I think, is the one who is most pointed. Maybe because he's no longer in Capitol Hill, he seems to be the one who gets the most specific in implying or talking about what's in there. And at the January 7th press conference, which you can, at 20pages.org, people can either watch the press conference in full or read a transcript or read an article called Must Read Quotes. But he talks very specifically at that press conference. And, whereas other Congress people sometimes back away from mentioning Saudi Arabia, for example, he said the 28 pages point a very strong finger at Saudi Arabia as the principal financier of 9/11. And so I think as far as what's in there that I'm most curious about, it's a lot of people say, well, we've already heard for years that there's Saudi Arabia connections with 9/11, so what's the big deal? And I guess that's the question that's on my mind. I don't think these former Senator Graham, Congressman Jones, Lynch, and Massey, I don't think they would be making this effort if whatever in there wasn't provocative enough to merit that. In other words, it must be pretty damning, the next level of detail of what was uncovered as they started to investigate this.
Well, now we get
keyword.
Now we get to get into a favorite topic of mine. How familiar are you with the 9/11 Commission, which absolved the Saudi Arabian government?
I'm growing increasingly familiar with it. As I said, 9/11 was not an interest, something I knew a whole lot about. Beyond what maybe a typical or average plus person might know, from a historical point of view. I had a basic understanding, but since deciding to launch 20pages.org, I've been delving deeper into it, and I'm about to finish reading, thanks to listening to your earlier great episode where you interviewed Philip Shannon, the author of The Commission. I'm wrapping up that book. So I am familiar with it. To the extent you said absolve the Saudi Arabian government, I guess that's a word that's in contention right now. With the big press this week, the New York Times coverage, and the news of the 20th hijacker, Zacarias Moussaoui, testifying as to some specific Saudi connections that he had. Saudi Arabia was quick to point to the 9/11 Commission report this week and declare that it had absolved them, and they've also used that in the court case that is underway, pitting the family members and survivors of 9/11 and the insurance companies that backed them against Saudi Arabia. In that court proceeding, they've tried to point to the Commission report as absolving them. But this week, we've seen depositions and affidavits from 9/11 commissioners specifically saying no, that it's wrong to interpret it as absolving them.
Well, what they did is they pointed to certain charities, but they didn't talk about the government. There's a specific sentence, and unfortunately I did not get it for this interview, that shows, it basically says that the Saudi government had nothing to do with it. And on the day of the release of the 9/11 report, Lee Hamilton specifically said that we have found no evidence that the Saudi government helped to support or had anything to do with 9/11. Now,
Senator Graham had an interesting quote on that topic. At the press conference, a reporter asked, when you say Saudi Arabia, Senator, are you talking about the government or are you talking about private actors? And he said, given the nature of the kingdom, I'm speaking of the kingdom. He says, in fact, in this litigation, whether it's when any institution, whether it's a financial institution, a charitable institution, or religious institution is raised as a possible co-conspirator, the kingdom throws a blanket of sovereign immunity over every entity. So it is a society in which it's difficult to make the kinds of distinctions between public, private, religious that we would in the United States.
Well, one of the things about the 9/11 Commission that it's famous for is that it said that ultimately it's of little practical significance. The source of the funding for the attacks is of little practical significance. So the 9/11 Commission does in fact absolve the government of Saudi Arabia, and that would include, people like Bandar, who was the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the United States. And the reason that the 9/11 Commission absolved Saudi Arabia has to do with what I think are two people specifically. And as I said, the 9/11 Commission was supposed to start its work where the Joint Congressional Inquiry left off. And what they did is they actually brought people over from the Joint Congressional Inquiry, people like Mike Jacobson and Dana Leeseman, who actually helped to author the 28 redacted pages, to the 9/11 Commission to continue their work. And one of the things Philip Zelikow did, who was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, was he blocked Dana Leeseman's access to those 28 redacted pages.
Right.
And as a result, she went through a back channel to gain access to those pages, and as a result, Philip Zelikow fired her. Another thing that Philip Zelikow did was he blocked half of the interview requests for Saudi investigators. And Dieter Snell was, I think he was one of the Saudi investigators. He was a staffer on the 9/11 Commission, on the 9/11 Commission, and he interviewed some of the people that were supposedly involved in the Saudi part of the plot. And so what the 9/11 Commission said was that they looked into the allegations of the 28 redacted pages and found, Philip Zelikow referred to them as, quote, wild accusations, but found that they were lacking. And it's interesting to me because, are you familiar with memoranda for the records of the 9/11 Commission?
Yes.
Yes, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just so people know, a memoranda for the record is basically a description of an interview with a witness, a handwritten description of an interview with a witness, and there are many available from the 9/11 Commission. And some of the individuals that the 9/11 Commission interviewed that had to do with the supposed Saudi part of the plot, it says directly within those MFRs that these people are not trustworthy at all. And I think there are 3 of them that say that specifically. And yet Saudi Arabia, was absolved, but quote unquote absolved. But another thing that they did, Philip Zelikow and Dieter Snell took part in a quote late night editing session to remove Saudi government support for the hijackers from the 9/11 report, and they they relegated them into footnotes in the back of the book. So that's essentially why the 9/11 Commission, quote unquote, absolved the government of Saudi Arabia because of those 2 individuals. But Philip Zelikow is responsible for a hell of a lot more than just that. And he's actually someone that I believe belongs in jail. And that's part, this whole 28 redacted pages story. I think that is a big story that's being ignored, is his part in absolving.
With this last week, with all the coverage that's been going on of this issue, many outlets turning to and quoting him, which is kind of understandable given his title as executive director, but I think a lot of them, well, pretty much all of them, are negligent in that they're not giving the full story or speaking to the controversial nature of Philip Zelikow and the controversial way in which he executed his role, the conflicts of interest that he had going into that job, where he was personal friends with Condoleezza Rice. That's a conflict of interest, in that he's going to be reviewing her performance leading into 9/11. The fact that he was on the Bush transition team, and on that transition team, he was, I believe, instrumental in the decision to lower the status and access of counterterrorist czar Richard Clark to the president. So he had
correct
a number of things where he was tied in, which points to that. And another thing, during the investigation, frequent phone calls with Bush's political advisor Karl Rove, which in Philip Shannon's book The Commission talks about the staff of the commission being really disturbed by the fact that their boss was having ongoing contacts with the White House when there should have been a completely impartial external entity. So when you had
but then
House,
he told his staffer not to take records of those phone calls.
Right. And when you had a White House that was in defense mode of Saudi Arabia, which has been pretty clearly documented, and former Navy Secretary and 9/11 Commission member John Lehman talked specifically about how he felt that the White House was just blatantly cutting off any avenue of inquiry that was pointing towards Saudi Arabia. It was critical that whoever's executive director of that commission take on a adversarial type role and do that. But every indication is that, and with the conflict of interest, is that that's not all what Zelikow did. And so that's something missing from a lot of the coverage right now when they're quoting Zelikow as an expert on this topic.
I've said that this is being reported on as if it took place within a vacuum, like the 28 redacted pages and the covering up of Saudi Arabia, but they don't get into the context of how Bush and Cheney fought against the Joint Congressional Inquiry from ever taking place. They don't talk about, how they refused to allow Abdusattar Sheikh, who was the landlord of 2 of the hijackers in San Diego, to testify before the Joint Congressional Inquiry. He was actually an FBI informant, and they tried to make it difficult for his handler, Stephen Butler, to testify before the Joint Congressional Inquiry, but he finally did. There's so much context and so many other things that people need to be aware of. And you talk about Philip Zelikow and his conflicts of interest. He also belonged to the Aspen Strategy Group, who Prince Bandar also belonged to, which is an interesting conflict of interest.
Right.
And
he also helped author the doctrine of preemptive war,
which they used
the Bush White House.
Which they used for the Iraq War.
Right. Exactly.
And you talk about Karl Rove. Karl Rove first elected Henry Kissinger to be the chairman of the 9/11 Commission, and he stepped down after the family members asked him about his business relations with the Bin Laden family.
Right.
So I wonder, would he have been a good person to cover up for Saudi Arabia? Probably. And then Karl Rove selected Thomas Keane, and so forth. So he could be considered an architect of the 9/11 Commission in a way.
Right. I remember Keane was surprised that the call from the White House came from a political advisor and not from maybe a chief of staff or someone in a different, role in the White House. That it was a political. The first indication that this was going to be highly politicized was the fact that the call to Keane came from a political advisor.
Right, and you mentioned John Lehman, and when Bush and Cheney went to testify before the 9/11 Commission at the White House, not together as opposed to being separate. There were no recordings allowed, no transcripts allowed, and they were not under oath. And John Lehman pushed, George Bush on the subject with regards to Bandar and Princess Haifa being connected to money of two of the hijackers. And according to Phil Sheenan, Bush, quote, dodged the questions. And, for that reason alone, George Bush should be, made to stand put on a stand to take questions in a court of law. Mm-hmm. Just for that, it's just so absurd. So anyway,
our system of government, that was part of the disappointing execution of the commission was Zelikow reluctance to put people under oath, to have them sign depositions, to serve subpoenas. It was so soft touch when in our system of government and accountability and checks and balances, nobody should be above swearing to tell the truth about what they've done.
Exactly. And, accountability is one of the biggest issues with regards to 9/11. After the 9/11 attacks, people in government who should have been held accountable for their, if you want to call it incompetence, if you want to call it criminality, the great thing about accountability is that it applies to both, incompetence and the criminality. People were rewarded and promoted, who should not have been. And one of the things that the family members hoped for with regards to the 9/11 Commission was that they would hold people accountable, and that simply did not happen. Not in the least. So anyway, Philip Zelikow, I think, belongs in jail, and I firmly believe that. But anyway, what will it take to declassify these pages?
Well, the short answer and the short route is a simple move of President Obama's signature to just simply declassify it himself. He has that power to do that and has reportedly twice promised 9/11 family members that he would do so.
Right. Kristen
Breitweiser and Bill Doyle. Yeah. Who each lost loved ones in the attacks on two different occasions, separated by more than a year, apparently, assured them that he would do that. It's within his power to do that. That's one route. I think it's going to take political pressure on Obama. I think it's going to take political pressure through Congress to persuade President Obama to do that. There is a little-known alternative route. So the president can declassify it, and there are also rules by which either the Senate or the House can declassify it over the president's objection, starting with a proposal from a member of either the House or the Senate Intelligence Committee. Very long shot route. that is probably not going to come to fruition. So I think the great hope is to have the president do it, and it's going to take political pressure and making it increasingly uncomfortable that these pages are being kept secret in the face of so many credible people saying that there's no good reason for it. You've got the chair and vice chair of the 9/11 Commission. You've got Senator Graham, who co-chaired that intelligence inquiry that produced the 28 pages. You've got congressional representatives from both parties who've read the 28 pages and saying it's not a threat to national security. These need to be released. So hopefully increasingly that drumbeat is going to cause these 28 pages to be declassified.
Well, I'm a cynic because, I've been doing this for years, and there was actually an effort in late 2006, the September 11th Advocates, or the Jersey Girls, released a petition calling for the declassification of those 28 redacted pages along with other pertinent 9/11 information. We got 17,000 signatures for their release. We brought it to Washington, D.C., and they were ignored. So, this effort to get them declassified has been going on for years. And I just, we mentioned Obama promising the family members to release those pages. What do you think about what happened with King Abdullah and him going to visit him and the new king being listed as a defendant in a lawsuit brought on by the 9/11 family members and all that stuff?
Well, the cozier our president is with the king and kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it definitely makes you potentially lose hope of getting the 28 pages declassified. I'm sure, and I know personally from communications with some of the 9/11 family members that seeing that kind of chumminess is really unsettling to those people who lost family members and are in litigation right now with the kingdom.
Well, to me, the whole thing was a big slap in the face to the 9/11 family members. The people that he brought with him were people like John McCain, who loves the 9/11 report, which, again, quote, absolved the Saudi Arabian government. They brought James A. Baker, whose law firm, Baker Botts, represented the Saudis against the 9/11 family members in a very early lawsuit. He brought Condoleezza Rice, who lied before the 9/11 Commission and who had an oil tanker named after her. I mean, it's just a huge slap in the face. Could you please tell us about the mandatory declassification review that is currently underway?
You bet. The mandatory declassification review is a process that is out there for pretty much anybody to request that a classified document be reviewed and considered for release. And it goes through a hierarchy. This process for the 28 pages that's underway right now was initiated by an attorney named Tom Julin, who is working with Dan Christensen, Anthony Summers, and Robin Swan. Now, Dan Christensen, as you know, is the investigative journalist at the Florida Bulldog, which used to be Broward Bulldog, who has been digging deep into the 9/11 cell in Sarasota. And then Summers and Swan wrote a book on 9/11. I can't remember the name of that book. Do you remember?
The 11th Day.
That's right, the 11th Day. And they had they've collaborated on this. But so this process has begun, and now it's at the top level of that process. It's in front of the what's called the Interagency Security Classifications Appeal Panel. Now, they review this request, review the 28 pages for whether they should be declassified, and then they make a recommendation to the president. Tom Julin in November said that he was told to expect a decision sometime this winter. I talked to Dan Christensen. He's not so sure it's going to be that quick. And there's no timetable on this and a lot of things where the government can kind of run the clock out and go to four corners and just let time tick by. I'm not really optimistic about this because if you take a look at the panel that comprises this board, as a representative, senior level representatives appointed by the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the National Archives, the Officer of the Director of National Intelligence, the National Security Advisor, and the Director of the CIA can opt to appoint a voting member. So this is not a panel of American peers. This, if you look at that list, I'm sure you're thinking the same thing I am. It's kind of the usual suspects of who want to keep this classified and who may personally, professionally benefit by keeping it classified. So it's not real sure that, other than maybe the National Archives, or the rest of that list, you look at it and you're not really optimistic that those representatives representing their respective department is going to do the right thing and recommend. And even if they do recommend, we're right back to it being a recommendation to the president. Now, if it did happen to be very extraordinary and I think would amp up the pressure on Obama to declassify it, but I think I'm not really optimistic about that route, which is why we're really encouraging people who want to see these pages released to get involved. And it doesn't take much time at all to get involved. The principal avenue of this movement right now is House Resolution 14. It was introduced by Congressman Walter Jones of North Carolina and Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts, a Republican and a Democrat. These have very bipartisan support. Both sides of the aisle are represented on this resolution. It's a resolution that urges the president to declassify the 28 pages. So it itself is not binding either, but again builds that political pressure that we're talking about. And so our emphasis at 28pages.org is on having people contact their House representative and get them to read the 28 pages and support the resolution, co-sponsor resolution HRes 14 to declassify it, and to contact the Senate and help us get a senator to introduce a resolution in that body along the same lines, urging the president to do this. It's important. It's interesting to note that several years ago there were 46 senators co-signed a letter to then President Bush urging him to declassify the 28 pages. 46. So we've been there before, and we're hoping to get back there again to where you've got that many people. And once you get to 51, now that alternative process I talked about, where the Senate could declassify it by itself, or the House could declassify by itself, but becomes viable. But so that's why we try to focus people on contacting Congress.
Right. Are you hoping that releasing the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry will lead to opening up doors to other cover-ups concerning 9/11?
Yes. In terms of the word cover-up, to me, one of the ones that I'm most interested in is, we mentioned a moment ago, is, for example, the Sarasota cell. Here is a situation where we had 9/11 hijackers who were having frequent contact and physical visits with a wealthy, well-connected Saudi family in Sarasota. That family up and urgently left the country about 2 weeks before 9/11. And we talk about urgency, we mean to the extent that there were brand new, newly registered vehicles in the driveway, fresh food in the refrigerator and on the counter, clothing still on the rack in the closets, safe doors swinging open in the bedroom. I mean, that's how sudden we're talking about. And this cell was not even disclosed to the FBI knew about it and didn't disclose it to Senator Graham and to the inquiry that produced the 28 pages. By all indications, the 28 pages, I think, are hinging a lot on the San Diego cell and what we know about that. Well, the FBI has been blocking attempts to get access to and understand what they know about this cell in Sarasota, and that's what the Florida Bulldog has been so doggedly pursuing, is FBI documents on that. At first, the FBI said that they checked into it and that they found no connections, but there's basically nothing to it. And then Dan Christensen asked them for documents about that, how they reached that conclusion, they said, well, we don't really have any documents, which just, any investigation of even a missing dog is going to have a document, much less this. Well, now there's a Freedom of Information lawsuit underway, and there's a federal judge who's taking a very skeptical look at the FBI and its conduct, and he's now reviewing what they have coughed up 80,000 pages of documents relating to that cell. So to me, that the 20 pages is going to be interesting and open a door, but I think it's going to cause people to now start looking elsewhere, looking to Sarasota, and there are many other locations that Senator Graham says we don't know what was missing there, where there were other cells in, I think, Falls Church, Virginia, Paterson, New Jersey, other locations. Well, are there other Saudi connections there as well, potentially? So, and it's not just about knowing what the Saudi connections might be. It's also about peeling back and revealing what is the nature of this cover-up by the FBI. Why are they so gun-shy about sharing what they've done?
Well, the FBI they have their investigation, the Penn Bomb investigation, and they would have meetings, or they had a meeting with the family members, and we were told that there was no warning that the 9/11 attacks were going to come, that nobody had any idea that this was going to happen, and one of the questions Kristen Brotweiser asked was, how is it possible that within hours of the attacks you guys could swoop in on the exact flight schools that these people, were training at, if you had no idea that this was going to happen? And they were told that they got lucky. So the FBI, look at their anthrax attack investigation, how horrible that was. They're not exactly the most trustworthy organization in the world. And they have a lot to answer for with regards to 9/11, about other issues. Again, like I said, Robert Wright was shut down. Why was he shut down? So the thing about the 28 redacted pages that's important to the families is that they want to bring it in to the courtroom as evidence, to use. And every time that 9/11 makes it into a courtroom, we learn a lot of information that we didn't know before,
Exactly.
that was supplied to us from the 9/11 Commission, and the quote unquote definitive account of 9/11. And it's interesting. Musawi this week, it's being reported about his statement that he gave to lawyers representing the family members about what he knew about Saudi Arabia, people in Saudi Arabia helping to finance the attacks. And I quickly want to say, before we talk about Musawi, is that he was never actually, it was never ruled that he was insane. He was ruled competent to stand trial. So,
where his defense attorneys made the argument, in the act of defending him, but that argument is not found compelling, and he was deemed competent.
Exactly. So people will say that, well, he's a crazy nut and that we shouldn't listen to what he says, but that's not exactly the case. So this week he brought up names like Prince Bandar, Turki al-Faisal, the owner or one of the owners of Fox News, who just dumped all of his Fox News stock, I think, or some of it. And, what happened at the Musawi sentencing phase, it wasn't actually a trial, it was a sentencing phase, because he had pled guilty. We found out from FBI agent Michael Antisef that, of course, the FBI was well aware that al-Qaeda had plans to slam, they thought of the idea of terrorists slamming planes into buildings or using them as weapons and so forth. And, we were told repeatedly that no one had any idea and nobody in government could possibly conceive of this. And here we have an FBI agent telling us the exact opposite. So, a lot can come out in a court of law. And, I would love to see Philip Zelikow be called in to testify, to explain why the 9/11 Commission's report, absolved him, essentially. But anyway,
right.
What have been...
I was just going to
Go ahead.
say, the other interesting angle that potentially could come out of this 28 pages is more perspective, perhaps, on FBI agent Mark Rossini being told he was assigned to the 9/11 CIA unit and was forbidden to share information about the San Diego hijackers with FBI higher-ups, which looks like probably the most deadly decision in this whole thing. It might be some more perspective on that, to the extent this might focus on San Diego.
Well, now you just opened up a whole can of worms. The Alex Station incident that he's referring to, and Alex Station was the name of the CIA's bin Laden unit. Mark Rossini found out that one of the hijackers got a visa to enter the United States, and he was assigned, along with Doug Miller, to Alex Station, and he wanted to send a cable. It was Doug Miller, I think, that wanted to send the cable. Wasn't it, or was it Mark Rossini?
I think so. I believe it was him.
Well, either way.
They were both told not to. Yeah, they were working together.
One of them wanted to send the cable, and they were told by Michael Ann Casey not to send the memo to the FBI, and she was directed to tell them that by Tom Wilshire. But later in the day, Michael Ann Casey sends out a cable within the CIA telling them that the FBI had been notified, which seems like extremely criminal behavior to me. But you're right. When you look at the San Diego hijackers, that leads to other stories. Like, for instance, the NSA said that they were monitoring about 8 phone calls that the hijackers made from San Diego to the Yemen hub, the al-Qaeda hub in Yemen. But they couldn't, decipher where the calls were coming from. They could only tell where the calls were going to. And we found out from NSA whistleblower William Binney and confirmed by Thomas Drake on my show that the NSA did know the identities of the phone calls of the hijackers, where the calls were coming from, which meant that the NSA knew those terrorists were in the United States and didn't bother to tell the FBI. So that's something else that who knows what could come out of this.
Right. And I think it points back to Thomas Massey saying if this comes out, there's going to be anger, frustration, and resentment. And I think a lot of that could point at our own intelligence agency and their conduct.
Well, apparently, Thomas Drake from the NSA, I think, testified before the Joint Congressional Inquiry, and there's no record of his testimony, just the fact that he testified. They, destroyed it, according to him.
Right.
If I were to ask you what have been some of the biggest obstacles you've become aware of since starting this fight to release these pages? No, I haven't.
No, but I think some of the obstacles are, in the House, trying to get HRES 14 moving along. It's been a two-step process to this point of first trying to get people in Congress to read the 28 pages, which they have to ask permission of their intelligence committee to do so, and then go into a quiet, soundproof room where they have 2 minders watching them. They're not allowed to bring a notebook in there and read the 28 pages. And so you've got that hurdle. And every indication is that very few in Congress have bothered reading the 28 pages, which, if you think about it, you've got Congressman Thomas Massey, when he read the 28 pages and got my attention at the press conference, when he described the experience of reading it, he said, he talked about going to that soundproof room, and he said it was a very disturbing event for me to read this. He said, I had to stop every 2 or 3 pages and rearrange my perception of history, and it's that fundamental, he said. Now, you and I are curious to read what's in the 28 pages. We're citizens, right? We've got all these House representatives and senators who are charged with helping to guide the foreign and defense and counterterror policy of this country who have not bothered reading the 28 pages. It's a half an hour to read 28 pages. You'd think out of simple human curiosity they'd want to read the 28 pages, much less their professional duty to read the 28 pages. So, that's kind of an obstacle, is pushing against that. Congressman Stephen Lynch, one of the leaders on this issue, he recently set up that January 7 press conference, and he's going to try a different tack in this session of Congress, which is to basically ask his peers to trust him and his judgment that, these can be declassified. You don't necessarily need to read it yourself. You should, so you can have a deeper understanding of the terror apparatus that we're dealing with. But he's going to try to get people to start co-sponsoring the resolution, even if they haven't read it. That's the challenge. And I think the other challenge is the fact that there are no, and we touched on this in a recent blog post at 28pages.org, is that one of the things that distinguishes this fight is that you've got vocal people on one side arguing, but then there's really no vocal champion out there arguing on the other side. The forces that are keeping this quiet are behind the scenes. They're hidden. They're a big web of influence that Saudi Arabia has on Capitol Hill with lobbyists, including former Senator Norm Coleman, who co-chairs a major Republican super PAC, and who once condemned Saudi Arabia for spreading extremism. He's now a lobbyist for Saudi Arabia. And it goes on and on. The money that Saudi Arabia donates to think tanks that are quoted in the media, and we don't realize the influence that Saudi Arabia and other countries have through these think tanks.
Well, I said today that the cover-up or protecting Saudi Arabia is not just about oil or the fact that they could influence gas prices and so forth. It's about the fact that people in this country love Saudi Arabian money, and also their influence in the region. But people love their money, like the Bush family.
Right.
And
you've got that foreign influence, but you're also another quiet force that is on the other side of this is the intelligence community, as we just talked about. I think has a very strong interest in keeping this quiet and shielding themselves from embarrassment and accountability, and so they're very influential. And they're very influential on the intelligence committees that deal with this topic. The people who end up on the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, they're almost invariably people who play ball for the intelligence committee and who, rather than being overseers, end up being spokespeople and defenders of the intelligence committee instead of adding that layer of accountability that they're supposed to by our system of government.
Yeah, it's really disgusting. I know. What do you have to say to people who think releasing the 28 redacted pages is a, quote, limited hangout?
And by that, for our audience, I think limited hangout's a term that was inadvertently coined by President Nixon. I believe he was on the tapes talking about a limited hangout, meaning you have some secret you're keeping, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but you put out just enough to maybe satisfy people's appetite, but in fact you're holding back on the greater secret. Is that right?
Well, some people have said that. They're just letting this part of the cover-up out to satisfy people's curiosity and so on and so forth. And I just think, I talked to Lori Van Auken, one of the Jersey girls, about this, and she says, release the pages, This is just one aspect of the cover-up, but it has to be resolved. So release the pages, and maybe, as we talked about, it will lead to other things. Right now,
go ahead.
Right now there are people out there, the people who say Israel did 9/11. They're piggybacking their little theory that Israel did 9/11 on this push to get these 28 redacted pages released because, supposedly it talks about multiple foreign entities. And I have never, ever once heard anybody related to the Joint Congressional Inquiry, never once from Bob Graham, have I ever heard any indication that these pages talk about Israel. In fact, if you read the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11, they praise Israeli intelligence. And I don't think that they would praise Israeli intelligence only to come back and say, Israel supported the hijackers in any way.
Right. And for those people who think, based on various documented things like the Israeli art students and the dancing Israelis, that type of thing, which people can look up. It's one thing for them to think, oh, maybe Israel had foreknowledge or whatever. It's another to conclude, oh, that's in these 28 pages. Like you said, there's been no indication from anybody who's read the 28 pages and who talks about it. I mean, I don't know what's in the 28 pages. I don't know.
Right, but there's an absolute...
What you and I both work off of is, okay, what do we specifically hear from people who have read the 28 pages? And so there's somebody out there who has read them who hints in this direction. And yes, it does say multiple countries, but that could very well be other Gulf states. So I
was going to ask you, what countries are your guesses? My guesses are the UAE, possibly Turkey, maybe Qatar. I don't know. Those are my guesses. What do you think?
I really don't know either. I just don't know. I'm thinking Gulf states is what I would lean towards, but let's get those 28 pages out and we can end all this speculation.
Right, exactly.
On the 28 pages. There's going to be more speculation after that, but let's get it out there and decide what it means.
Yeah, exactly. Just let's resolve this one issue. Maybe it'll lead to other things. Hopefully.
Well, yeah. Ray McGovern, who was a CIA analyst. He talked about the 28 pages in December, and he thinks they're pretty significant. He says, there's so many things about the story of 9/11. He said that need to be put together. He says, and he said, I think these 28 pages are going to start unraveling just like a mummy. He said, pull on these 28 pages, and then you're going to unravel the whole thing. So,
well, we'll see. My thing is arrest Philip Zelikow, put him on the stand. I think if you tug on that thread, it would, the whole 9/11 cover-up would unravel. But,
right.
The 28 redacted pages are important. What can people do to help get these pages released? Just call their senators, write their representatives?
Go to 28pages.org, and on there you'll see a link on the top that says Take Action. And depending on how much time you have, a quick call to Congress. We've got a little script there. I mean, really, to call Congress and register your opinion by calling, you don't need to be prepared to give a big speech. You just need to tell them to support House Resolution 14 and ask them if they've read the 28 pages. We're trying to put pressure on Congress to read the 28 pages, not only so that they feel more confident and interested in declassifying them, but also so we've taken that first step of at least Congress being informed and understanding the dynamics of this so that they can cast an informed vote. So going to 28pages.org, calling Congress. We've got, if you don't feel like making the phone call, we've got pre-written letters where you can just print it out, fill in your info, and mail it off to Congress. And again, these letters and our phone calls, we always emphasize asking, have they read the 28 pages? Have they asked permission to do so and to support the resolution? So that's the main thing that they can do. And it doesn't take much time, and it does have an impact. People get skeptical about our ability to sway policy, but it really does matter. Politicians do care. They care about votes. They care about opinions, sometimes too much. But here's a case where we can use their concentration on votes and elections and embarrassment and turn it to something good and turn it into transparency on this issue.
Well, I would argue, my feelings are that Congress is bought and paid for, but, whatever.
But that's true, but if there are examples if you look at the alleged chemical weapon attack in Syria that was going to be used to launch a drive-by cruise missile strike, what the thing that turned that back was people calling Congress. There's no doubt. At the time, it was said 90% of the calls that were coming in said, "Don't get involved in this. Do not do this. Do not intervene," and that turned it back. So, I mean, I definitely share and understand the general feeling of frustration. And
well, I think Russia had a lot to do with that as well. Russian pressure.
Well, yeah. But I think the American public really played a big role in that too.
Is there anything else that you would like to promote at this time?
No, just people going to 28pages.org, and also we've got a presence on social media. If you're on Twitter, please follow us at our tag is at 28pages. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/28pages911. You can just go to 28pages.org and you'll find links to those as well. Following us in social media helps in a couple ways. Number one, you, the listeners, will stay informed of what's going on with this issue, which I think is a very interesting issue. And number two, it's numbers. Politicians, the media, they look at numbers, and the more followers that we have on Facebook and social media, it starts to get their attention that there's a lot of people who care about this and are interested in it, and it also is a way for interested listeners to share and pass this information on and build this awareness of this issue.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Brian, for what you're doing, and I want to thank you for promoting my show the other day. That was very kind of you.
Oh yeah, it was very sincere. I mean, it's been an impressive. I'm kind of honored to join what's been a very impressive list of guests that you've been putting together. I really enjoy the show.
I'm doing my absolute best to put forward the best of the best. So, and the fact that we were lied to about 9/11, that's the truth. We were lied to about 9/11, and that's something I'm hoping a lot of people come to accept. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and good luck with everything. And if you need help, let me know.
I will. Thank you.
All right. Take care.